And thanks to at home for joining us this hour. Really happy to have you here. Great to have you with us. Today, of course, was President's Day. And today we saw protests all over the country once again. In Washington, D.C., yes, as you see in the upper left-hand corner of your screen here, but also in state capitals all across the country. You see there Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and Denver, Colorado, and look at that, Columbia, South Carolina, big turnout. The same coalition, same group that organized protests at 50 state capitals a couple of weeks ago, organized these as well today. Big turnout, lots of places. And, it wasn't just at state capitals. We saw pretty big turnout at a lot of town halls, city halls, any location basically that has anything to do with government. You can see some of the images here from outside City Hall in Orlando, Florida, and San Francisco. Also big protests in Seattle and in Philly. We're going to be looking in detail at some of those big protests today all over the country. That's coming up in just a few minutes. You will want to see that for sure. We're also going to be talking with a U.S. Senator who joined the protest at his state capitol. Today, U.S. Senator Chris Van Hollen is going to be joining us live here this hour in just a few minutes. So there's a lot to show you, a lot to talk about in terms of how that all went down today. A big national day of protest against the Trump administration. We'll get to all of that, but we are going to start tonight here on Nuclear Street.
Nuclear Street, Proton Lane, Bombing Range Road, the Atomic Body Shop, Atomic Plumbing, Atomic Health Center, Atomic Bowling, even an atomic supermarket. Atomic, atomic, atomic. Where are we anyway, a Captain Marvel comic book? No, we're in the state of Washington, Richland, Pasco, and Kennewick, the Tri-City area around the Hanford nuclear site. That's where they produced the plutonium that America dropped on Nagasaki, the high school, home of the bombers. Inside the front entrance, believe it or not, a bomb inlaid into the floor. And on the football helmets, mushroom clouds.
That is from the Today Show in 1983, a profile on the Hanford nuclear site in Washington state. The Hanford nuclear site, Richland, Washington, was opened as part of the Manhattan Project during World War II. And when that very cheery, slightly eerie Today Show story on it ran 40 years later, Hanford at that point in 1983 was still chugging along, still open. The last of Hanford's 9 nuclear reactors was not shut down until 1987. That shutdown was in the wake of the Chernobyl nuclear disaster in the Soviet Union in 1986. That 1986 disaster had a way of focusing the world's attention on the threat of mass radioactive contamination. And again, Hanford shut down its last nuclear reactor the following year. But you don't just shut down a nuclear site like that and walk away. Hanford has continued to be a site not only of national security importance, but also of frequent news coverage, much less cheery news coverage over the years, but all about that same site.
The first official calculations of radiation exposure around Hanford in the late 1940s took many by surprise. The levels announced today by a government-appointed study group were high. Radiation is measured in rads, 1 rad equal to about a dozen chest X-rays. The new study calculates that more than 13,000 people got doses of at least 33 rads, the same as 400 chest X-rays. And a small number of infants may have gotten doses up to 2,900 rads to their thyroids, mostly from drinking the milk of cattle grazing on radioactive grasses. The government limits nuclear power workers to less than 1 rad exposure a year, limits weapons workers to 5 rads. The Chernobyl nuclear accident in the Soviet Union exposed many to 1,500 rads, but that's still only half as much as the 2,900 rad exposures around Hanford. UCLA radiation specialist Dr. Robert Gale, who treated Chernobyl victims, worries about Hanford.
So one may expect now or in the future to see thyroid abnormalities and very likely thyroid cancers.
Tom Bailey farms downwind of Hanford. Many of his relatives have had cancer over the years. Today he was angry at the polluters.
Well, who the hell do they think they are?
That was from 1990, not long after Hanford stopped operating as a nuclear production facility and the country started contemplating the seriousness of the contamination problem there. It was not just cows grazing on radioactive grasses over the years. It's been radioactive bunnies and radioactive tumbleweeds, and ultimately the revelation that it was tens of millions of leaking radioactive waste. Over Hanford's 40-plus years in business, that facility produced nearly 2/3 of the plutonium that was used to build our American arsenal of nuclear weapons. It also created a massive 580-square-mile site that is believed to be the most contaminated radioactive site in the Western Hemisphere. You might remember last week we talked about that sort of insane drone footage that we got. Video footage that we got of the drone hitting Chernobyl. Russia crashed what appears to have been a drone carrying explosives into the big concrete and steel cocoon, the big sarcophagus that encases the destroyed nuclear reactor at Chernobyl from that radioactive site in Ukraine in the former Soviet Union. That site from Chernobyl, they've got that reactor encased, actually has sort of a twin in Hanford. Hanford has also built those same kinds of protective casings, that same kind of reinforced sarcophagus or cocoon around their dead, destroyed reactors. And the point of those very eerie structures is to contain the radioactivity inside those destroyed nuclear sites, until sometime in the future they maybe cool off some, and hopefully by then we'll have better technology for handling so much waste and debris that is so radioactive. In August 1976, there was an explosion at one of the buildings at Hanford, and that building where that explosion happened was so radioactive that they could not open it up to start cleaning it until 29 years after the explosion. Happened in 1980. The rumor it happened was sealed in 1989. They didn't open it up to start cleaning it until 2005. I don't know what your job is or what the hardest job is that you've ever had. But I'm going to venture a guess that none of us have any envy for the American heroes who do the work of suiting up into hazmat suits and respirators and entering those facilities at Hanford and handling the tens of millions of gallons of radioactive waste that is currently leaking out of those underground tanks that date back to the 1940s. Mostly what they're trying to do now is vitrify it. You know the word vitrification? It means to turn something into glass. They're trying to turn much of the radioactive waste at Hanford now into glass in these massive vitrification plants, because they're hoping that if they turn it into glass, it won't leak again when they bury it, because it won't seep, because it's glass. I mean, one of the things we have to do as a country is manage that mess that we made at that site. Where, you know, sure, we needed all that plutonium, okay, but in making it, we really did create the most contaminated radioactive site in the Western Hemisphere, which happens to be in an inhabited U.S. state, right in the middle of our country, right? And so that work, that terrifying, painstaking, very difficult, very expensive work just has to be done. Radioactivity does not clean itself up. And if you leave it alone, it has a way of following you home. Donald Trump just fired the people who do that work at the Hanford nuclear site. Headline: Trump layoffs leave Hanford nuclear site with skeleton crew. Senator Patty Murray, Democrat of Washington, quote, "The Trump administration has begun indiscriminately laying off Hanford workers in Washington state. Trying to run Hanford with a skeleton crew is a recipe for disaster that could have irreversible impacts." They're cutting the people who do cleanup work, security engineers, they're cutting at Hanford. In the Pacific Northwest, there is still a working commercial nuclear reactor that feeds the largest electricity supplier in that part of the country, which is the Bonneville Power Administration. Trump, in addition to firing the cleanup crews at Hanford, also just fired hundreds of people, more than 600 employees who keep the lights on at Bonneville, too. Mass layoffs at Bonneville Power Administration raise concerns about reliability of power grid. They're firing electricians there, engineers, line workers, cybersecurity experts. Again, that's the power grid, the biggest electricity supplier in the Pacific Northwest, including some of their electricity being supplied by a big commercial nuclear plant. Is that what you voted for? Cutting the people who maintain the power grid? Cutting the security engineers who manage the cleanup at one of the worst sites of nuclear contamination in the world, which is in our country? Trump has also now started firings at the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, which does, among other things, nuclear security. You know, we also have a whole National Nuclear Security Administration, or at least we did. Now we don't have a whole one because of what Trump has decided to do to them. You know, I mentioned that footage from last week from Chernobyl, when that Russian drone smashed into the reactor shield at the Chernobyl nuclear site last week. One of the reasons we knew that was very bad, but it wasn't a radioactivity catastrophe, is because our own government, one of our own agencies in the federal government, the National Nuclear Security Administration, maintains sensors at the Chernobyl nuclear site to monitor in case anything goes wrong there. So when that Russian drone attack hit the Chernobyl reactor sarcophagus, one of the ways we were able to be sure that that didn't result in a catastrophic release of radioactivity is because we've got expert nuclear monitoring at that site. That is maintained by the National Nuclear Security Administration, which is part of the federal government. Here at home, the National Nuclear Security Administration maintains and refurbishes and ensures the safe and secure storage and transportation and maintenance of our nation's thousands of nuclear weapons. NNSA runs the National Nuclear Labs. They develop nuclear propulsion systems for our nuclear submarines. They are the people in charge of making sure that terrorists don't get their hands on a nuclear weapon, or that nuclear weapons technology doesn't get stolen and sold on the black market. They are also in charge of making our new nuclear weapons and inspecting those weapons, and Trump is firing them, firing hundreds of them. The agency only has like 1,900, 2,000 people. Thursday night, they sent out termination notices to more than 300 of them. Termination notices reportedly to hundreds of staff of the small, expert, professional, very important National Nuclear Security Administration. Isn't there anything about the name of that agency that might suggest to you that maybe this isn't the best place to make cuts? What about National Nuclear Security Administration bugs you and makes you think that one is dispensable? Do you want to ask your mom? How old are you? You ever worked in this field? By Friday, the geniuses in the Trump administration had maybe Googled what this agency does or something, maybe heard from a few members of Congress. And so after sending out those termination notices on Thursday night, they tried on Friday to take it back. They tried to unfire the hundreds of people from the National Nuclear Security Administration that they had just fired the night before. But because, again, they're geniuses, they fired these people effective immediately and cut all of these people off from their work email and all their work computer systems and everything. And then a day later, when they decided, ooh, maybe we shouldn't have fired the National Nuclear Security Administration, they had no way to get in touch with all those people they had just fired to say, oops, sorry, please, will you come back? This is the level of expertise and efficiency we're dealing with this new administration. Trump administration officials on Friday, quote, attempted to notify some employees who had been let go the day before that they are now due to be reinstated, but they struggled to find them because they did not have their new contact information. In an email sent to employees at the National Nuclear Security Administration, obtained by NBC News, officials wrote, quote, the termination letters for some NNSA employees are being rescinded, but we do not have a good way to get in touch with those personnel. Do you know any of them? Could you drive around your neighborhood and knock on some doors, see if we can get our National Nuclear Security Administration personnel back? Because we don't know how to find them. The President of the United States allowed his top campaign donor to send basically random, unvetted young people with no experience and no subject matter expertise at all, into the agency that keeps America's nuclear weapons secure. And Donald Trump had those kids fire the people who work to keep America's nuclear weapons secure. And he had them fire them without those kids apparently having any idea what those people in that agency do, and without any way to get them back once they realized, okay, maybe no, that wasn't a good one. Has it occurred to any of you to maybe resign? If you're running a government this way, on national nuclear security grounds alone, have you considered resigning? People have resigned for much smaller sins and much less damage to their country than this. Have you been any part of this process? In the White House, in DOJ, any part of the Trump administration that has overseen the accidental firing of the National Nuclear Security Administration? Have you considered resigning? This weekend, USA Today reports that 20 people in the Office of Neurological and Physical Medicine Devices at the FDA were just fired. Perhaps coincidentally, that is the unit at the FDA that was investigating Elon Musk's company, the company that he owns that wants to graft computer chips onto people's brains. People doing that oversight work for Elon Musk's company are just fired at the FDA. And on that point, on that story, here's the thing we're seeing over and over again now. Quote, the dismissal letters sent to FDA reviewers cited performance reasons, even though these employees had no issues on their prior performance and had received top-notch rankings several weeks ago, according to 2 sources familiar with the matter. So they're being told they're being fired for performance reasons, but there's nothing in any of their performance reviews that would support that. In fact, quite the contrary. We're seeing that at FDA, where they fired people who were in charge of regulating the computer chips Elon Musk wants to graft into your brain. We're also seeing similar reports in the firings of the National Nuclear Security Administration folks. People being told they're being fired for poor performance, even though there's nothing in their performance review history that would suggest any poor performance. Same thing is happening among people being fired at USDA, and at the Department of Education, and at the U.S. Forest Service, and at the VA, and at the Small Business Administration, and at the Department of Transportation. NBC News reviewed documentation there that shows people being fired supposedly for performance reasons had just received, quote, exceptional performance reviews. And so I don't know if the pattern here seems as obvious to everybody as it does to me, but it seems to me like it's a pattern, right? There was no $50 million in condoms for Gaza that Hamas used to make their bombs. There are no 150-year-old Americans getting Social Security checks. The Reuters news agency did not get a government contract to deceive the public. The government does not fund the New York Times or Politico to produce positive stories about Democrats. The U.S. government does not pay for celebrity junkets to Ukraine. That was literally Russian propaganda. And the U.S. government is not right now trying to fire hundreds of thousands of people who work in the U.S. government because they've all had bad performance reviews. This isn't happening. One way to tell when somebody doesn't actually have a good reason for what they're doing is when every reason they give you for that thing is very obviously made up. None of the things they're saying about why they need to do these mass, and in many cases, apparently illegal firings, holds up once you put it up to the light. But they're going ahead. They're now firing the people who work at the CDC on bird flu, as bird flu becomes a massive multi-state epidemic affecting tens of millions of animals in America, and increasingly, people. They have now stopped all of the programs in Mexico run by the State Department's Bureau of International Narcotics and Law Enforcement. What do these programs in Mexico do for the State Department's Bureau of International Narcotics Law Enforcement? What do they do? Oh, that's the part of the U.S. government that tries to stop the supply chain for fentanyl coming into this country. All of their actions have been stopped. They've now started firing people at the part of HHS that funds childcare and Head Start. They are firing the people who work at Gettysburg. They are firing the people who work at Shenandoah National Park in Virginia. And, I asked a minute ago, like, who voted for this? Maybe you don't care about any of those things that I just mentioned. Maybe you only care about stopping immigration, about making immigration restriction work like lightning, making that the most important and top priority thing that the U.S. government does, go fast, get people out of here. Maybe that's your motivation. I don't know. I think it might be for some people who voted for Trump, right? If so, please consider that Trump is also now firing immigration judges in large numbers with no explanation and no notice. With more than 3 million immigration cases backlogged in the system, they are firing the judges who handle those cases, which will grind the system further to a halt. Because efficiency. Tonight, the Washington Post is reporting, and NBC News has confirmed, that whatever Trump has sent Elon Musk's people to do at the Social Security Administration, it was apparently alarming enough to the career official running that agency right now that she resigned. Quote, the acting commissioner of the Social Security Administration left her job this weekend after a clash with Elon Musk's U.S. DOJ service over its attempts to access sensitive government records. Again, that's sensitive government records at Social Security. This follows a story also broken this weekend by the Washington Post that Elon Musk is also trying to access the most sensitive individual tax records that are maintained by the IRS. Personal individual IRS tax records. We're going to be speaking with the reporter who broke both of those stories, the one on Social Security, the one on the IRS. We're going to be speaking with him in just a moment. But I also have to note, and I kind of can't believe this, but for the 5th time since Donald Trump was sworn in just 4 weeks ago, we are also tonight watching developments in yet another plane crash. This time, it's a Delta Connections flight that originated in Minneapolis. It crashed on landing at Toronto Pearson International Airport. The flight was carrying 80 people. 18 have been injured. Some of them have been hospitalized. The FAA commissioner had taken action against Elon Musk's SpaceX company. Musk demanded his resignation. He resigned on Inauguration Day. Trump didn't bother appointing a replacement to run the FAA until after the first plane crash of this presidency, the midair collision over the Potomac River in Washington that killed 67 people. That was soon followed by another deadly plane crash in Northeast Philadelphia, which killed people both on the plane and on the ground. That was soon followed by another deadly plane crash in Alaska. In between, we had a plane crash into a tug on the ground at Chicago O'Hare, critically injuring an airport worker. We had a flight catch fire on the tarmac at Houston. Passengers had to evacuate not just down the stairs, but down the slides. We had 2 planes smash into each other on the ground at SeaTac. We had a small jet careen off the end of a runway into another small jet last week in Arizona. 4 people injured in that crash, 1 person killed. And now we have had this new crash of the Minneapolis to Toronto flight with the plane now upside down on the runway. Several people in critical condition, several people hospitalized. And frankly, what looks like a miracle that people weren't killed. There have been 5 plane crashes in the United States, or in flights originating in the United States, since Donald Trump started this second term as president 4 weeks ago. The Trump administration just, between plane crashes 4 and 5, told hundreds of employees at the FAA that they are fired, many of them expecting to be locked out of their offices as of tomorrow, which will be another day, once again, in the immediate aftermath of yet another plane crash, because we've had 5 so far since Donald Trump has been in office this term. The government does all sorts of things for which we need experience, expertise, accumulated and institutional knowledge, a stable training base, and a stable work environment in which professionals can oversee sensitive, complex, and life or death matters of 1,000 different kinds. What we have now instead is this wreckage. If you voted for Donald Trump, this is what you were voting for. Today, thousands of Americans in dozens of cities and in the U.S. Capitol came out and said no to what's going on. Let's stop this. The View from there, and a U.S. Senator who was with them. Coming up. Stay with us. That was Hillsboro, Oregon this weekend. This is a middle school gym, obviously a very hot ticket, a very full house. And that was not like some highly anticipated local sports playoff. That was not very well attended auditions for the middle school musical. This was a political event. This was a town hall. All these people turned out in person on a Saturday night in Hillsboro, Oregon, to come talk to and hear from their U.S. Senator, Senator Ron Wyden. And that announcer who was saying she was going to have to call capacity, she did end up calling capacity. They had to close the doors and not let anybody else in. So many people showed up at this town hall. People were standing out in the hallways outside the gym listening in on loudspeakers. Senator Wyden participated in 2 separate town halls this weekend for his constituents in Oregon. The local ABC affiliate reported that between the 2 events, thousands of people showed up. Quote, "It is rare for thousands of people to join these town halls." And it might be rare, but it is not just Oregon, and it is not just middle school gyms. One of the things we've been trying to keep an eye on recently is telephone town halls that members of Congress have been holding. Members of Congress who have to be in Washington because Congress is in session, but they want to connect with their constituents back home. They want to take questions. They want to tell people what they think is going on. People have been calling into telephone town halls with their members of Congress in massive numbers, like kind of shockingly massive numbers. This, for example, was Congressman Richie Neal of Massachusetts last week from his very messy desk in Washington. More than 8,000 people from his Western Massachusetts district dialed into his town hall. This was Congressman Joe Courtney of Connecticut. More than 10,000 people from his district dialed into his town hall. This was another one from Virginia Congresswoman Jennifer McClellan. She also got 10,000 people from her district to call into a town hall. In Maryland, Congressman Jamie Raskin's district, 13,000 people joined. Look at this one. This is Congresswoman Valerie Foushee. She's a relatively new member of Congress from North Carolina. She just started her second term. She held a telephone town hall last week for her North Carolina district. More than 19,000 people called in. Over 19,000. This is becoming a defining feature of what it is to live alongside whatever's going on with this administration. People from every state, red states, blue state, every chance they get an opportunity, people are showing up in person, making time in their day to at least join a telephone town hall. People who, by and large, are quite upset about what the White House is doing, people wanting to know what they can do. And today, this first President's Day of Donald Trump's second term in office, it was another big day of in-person protests. Protesters turned out at state capitals all across the country today. Look at this. Atlanta, Georgia in the upper left-hand corner. Sacramento, California, upper right-hand corner. That's Austin, Texas in the lower left. In the lower right, that's Indianapolis. In Boston, Massachusetts today, we had tons of protesters. Look at this. On the Boston Common, they then marched to the government center. And beyond state capitals, these protests were all over. City Hall in Burlington, Vermont today. Look at that. People climbed up on the snowbanks to get some more height, get a better vista. There were protests in Tucson, Arizona, and Ellsworth, Maine, Portland, Oregon, Hartford, Connecticut. People turned up in Chicago, Illinois today, in Winter Haven, Florida. There's a huge protest today in New York City, in Union Square. Look at that. Lower left-hand side there. New York, New York. Also a big turnout in St. Paul, Minnesota, where the high temperature today was 4 degrees. This gentleman getting right to the point in St. Paul, freezing my bleep off for democracy.